morning, good afternoon, and welcome to our workshop today, Communicating Data Findings Equitably. Our speakers are Alissa Marchant and Shelli Golson-Mickens Shelli is also an alum of American University's Measurement and Evaluation program, who's the sponsor of today's event. At American University, we are committed to pursuing inclusive excellence. One of our practices, shared from our Indigenous and Native communities, is to offer a land acknowledgement at the beginning of our meetings and events. The goal is to build our mindfulness of the historical processes in which we still participate. American University is founded on the unceded land of the Nacotchtank, Anacostan, and Piscataway peoples. I ask you to join me in acknowledging these communities, their elders both past and present, as well as future generations. American University also acknowledges that it was founded upon exclusions and erasures of many Indigenous peoples, including those on whose land this institution is located. With this acknowledgement, we commit to working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Those of you who attend our events know that we always provide a land acknowledgement. I would encourage you today to take this a step further and do some research on the land where you are sitting. If you are not aware of the history of that land, you can click on the link that we're going to put in the chat to research it, or send a text to the number that will also be put into the chat. So as we get started today, I'd like to introduce myself and my colleague moderating today's webinar. My name is Sarah Solomon Hennessy, and I'm joined by my colleague David Anderson. We are both alumni of AU's Masters of Measurement and Evaluation program. We'll be moderating the Zoom and Facebook Live questions today, and this recording will be available on the YouTube channel, which I believe we're going to also put that information into the chat. So if you have any questions for the presenters as we move through, we think you can put them in the chat. Again, they'll go to our moderator and then they'll either be spoken out loud or shared with the rest of the group. And we are going to have time for questions at the end of our presentation today. So if that is all of our housekeeping out of the way, I would like to turn it over to Alissa and Shelli, and very excited to get started.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. Well, we have some slides for you, so I'll get those going. All right. And let me know if those are not showing up for you. But thank you so much, Sarah, for that wonderful introduction. My name is Alissa, as she shared, and I'm the director at Innovation Network. We're a nonprofit evaluation firm, and we specialize in advocacy, organizing, and power building evaluation. So today we are talking about equity in our data communication. So this is more about how we're communicating about the way that we share back our findings and reports. So kind of like the end of the evaluation life cycle. And so to give you a quick background, our organization has been intentionally transforming towards equity in our practices, both internally and externally. And as we've been doing this, we really realized that there was not much information out there about how to communicate with an equity lens. So what we did is we kind of set out on our own to do some research, and we were able to pull resources from many different fields and sources and try to translate that in for our own purposes, but also can benefit anyone, especially who are communicating data findings like us. And so we're very happy to share what we've been learning, because we thought, like, this is really missing and wanted others to learn what we're learning too. And so you'll hear from me today to share back some of the strategies and what we've been learning about what it takes to communicate data findings equitably. And also the co-author, Shelli Golson-Mickens, who you'll hear from shortly. And I also want to shout out Kayla Bovair, who did all the illustrations that you'll see in this presentation and in the guide. And she's a senior associate here with us at Innovation Network as well. But let's start with a little background, like, what do we mean by equitably communicating and communications in an equitable way? So we want to talk about how we communicate out findings in a way that is accessible, engaging, relevant, particularly for communities who contribute to our evaluations, right? Like who we're engaging with in data collection. And to frame this conversation, when we think about equitable communications, we're really thinking about how we can shift both priorities and responsibility. So shifting priority to sharing our findings so that they really benefit those individuals and communities who we're working with in our evaluation. So, honestly, a lot of the work that we do is with foundations, and they tend to have a lot more money and funds to pay for evaluation. And what that means is like they have the power and ability to say, no, we want this for us. Like we're interested in learning topics that benefit like us and the questions that we have. And it ends up meaning that a lot of our evaluations can sometimes feel kind of extractive to those communities. So we are thinking about like what in our evaluations like is useful and can benefit the communities who are contributing their information and stories and data, and what benefits them. How can we share back findings in a way that supports them and the questions that they have and their interests. So we're also shifting as well responsibility for that, right, to ourselves and also to the funder and program, to share our findings in a way that folks can access, right? So we're breaking down those barriers about accessing and using information. We're not just putting out a report and saying, well, the information is there, they can access it, you can use it. We're really putting the responsibility on us to say, this is something that we want you to use and access, and we're going to put it out in a way that is digestible, right? So it's not on them to figure out how to process information in a way that's useful. It's on us. We want information to not only be accessible, we want it to be digestible, something that is useful. And so if anyone asks you like, why, why? And like, we don't want people to ask this question because we don't think it's necessary, but people will ask you why. Why should you do this? What's the benefit of making a shift and embracing communications with a view towards equity? And we think it's important to prioritize equitable communications, even though it can take time, maybe some additional skill, money. We think it should be non-negotiable because it really helps us share our findings in an authentic, inclusive, respectful way. It reflects the diverse reality of our world, uplifts the world we want to see in the future, tells a more true story. And it also gives a platform and can build relationship with the people who are most affected by the issues that we care about. Honestly, bottom line, the world just functions better when there's equity. Like equity does not just help those who are marginalized, it really benefits all of us. From the economy to the programs we support, and yes, even our reports, we can improve the reach, learning, and impact of data if we have an equitable approach to sharing that data. Okay, and this is not something that anyone is perfect at, honestly. Like we are very much learning right now about what it takes to communicate data equitably. And all of us, I think, are figuring out like how do we include equity in the work that we're doing. And sometimes it's hard, right? We're working against so many societal inequities that we've been absorbing since our own birth. We know that we will not get it right. We will stumble. And so we firmly believe that if we learn together, that's a way that we can learn better, right? We can accelerate learning by providing support to each other, sharing lessons. And that's partly why we're here today, because we want to create some common language and a space for us to connect and share stories and learn together. And so how do you communicate in an equitable way? So we're about to dive in to some strategies, but I do want to share first a little bit about where we come when we're sharing some of these strategies. So, Shelli and I spent a lot of time putting this guide together, and as I mentioned, we're just starting to implement some of these strategies. So we are not really experts ourselves, but we are sharing back some of the research and lessons that we've learned from what we've learned others recommend in doing and communicating equitably. And we have a few lessons ourselves from our experiences, but we're very much still learning. And I know the chat's broken right now, but if there are any other great resources out there or stories that you have, please share them. And hopefully those can be, shared when we get to the end of this presentation, because I think that we have as much to learn from you as hopefully we have to share as well. And I also want to note that, again, this guide comes at the end of the evaluation life cycle. So what we're talking about related to communications, it's not a stand-in at all for bias trainings, using data equity guidelines, employing anti-racist strategies. These are all super, super important parts of your practice. But you cannot communicate bias data equitably. And so we are not here to talk about those prerequisites to equitable communications. We're talking about, we're assuming you're coming in at the point where you have a wonderful evaluation that incorporates equity, and now you're thinking about, how do I communicate back findings? Okay. All right, well, let's share. Shelli, I'm going to turn to you to get us started with some guideposts and strategies for communicating equitably.
Awesome. Thank you, Alissa. All right. So, as mentioned earlier, our team conducted very extensive research to identify these guideposts. They were selected. The sources were from diverse fields. They were from diverse people, all around communicating equitably. And so we're going to jump into that. We're excited to share with you what we learned. You'll notice that the guideposts are not just a how-to checklist. Rather, they describe mindset shifts. And so when we're talking about, and what you'll see here is that we're talking about ways to shift our thinking. Some of these things you may already be doing, some of these things you may not have started yet, but these are all important ways of thinking that we should strive for, so that communicating equitably is incorporated into our thinking. So we're going to dive into each of these guideposts and share a few strategies. Yep, thank you, Alissa. And so let's jump in for real now. The first step is to develop a practice of self-reflection. And this is so important. And I mean, coming from the AU measurement and evaluation program, we've heard this before. But equitable communications is just another area where we have to be very self-reflective and think about our own thinking. This is a learning journey that we're talking about, and it requires intention, as any journey does. There's action, there's things that you have to do and put into yourself in order to complete the journey. But to be intentional, truly intentional in this work, we have to authentically reflect on our own thoughts, our own feelings, and our own biases, which we all hold regularly. So what we mean when we say this is that we must be willing to challenge our preconceived notions and even intentionally re-educate ourselves at times. And this extends beyond textbooks. There are ways that we, specific things that we can do to help us to truly coexist, because this is coexistence that we're talking about. And so let's get into some of those strategies for developing a practice of self-reflection. And so here are two things that we can do. One, we can communicate more equitably by understanding ourselves and understanding those around us. And this will help us to understand how our communications can affect others, and even how we receive what we see. It just helps us to have a three-dimensional view. This could involve deeply reflecting on what others' experiences have been like, or what our own cultural history has been like. And we're going to dig deeper to that in a second, but I also want to talk about this other strategy too. And that is acknowledging our own limitations, which I feel like Alissa touched on too earlier, where, you saw the cute picture where you're walking, you stumble, hit that rock, you stumble. This happens. It happens a lot. The process of getting curious about ourselves and others and self-reflection requires humility. And it's because we are not always going to get it right. And it's hard to say, like, we don't want to think that I'm going to make a mistake on this journey. But I just recently attended a convening, and the keynote speaker shared something that really stuck with me, and I think it resonates here. And she said that if we wait until we reach our goal to celebrate, we may never celebrate. We have to celebrate our progress along the way. The reason why we may never celebrate is because we might knock ourselves out of even the running if we don't celebrate the little wins that we have along the way. And of course, she was talking about building movements and this just powerful, like collective impact kind of topic. And I thought this really applies here because we have to give ourselves credit for the changes that we make. We have to recognize when we make mistakes, address those mistakes, and then keep moving forward so that we can continue to get better. So I thought that was an important point to share to this group as well. And now we can dig into getting curious about ourselves and others. So what does this mean? Getting curious about ourselves and others. This is literal. It means exactly what you see. It means doing intentional things to learn about yourself, your own culture, and learning about other cultures as well. And there's specific ways that we can do this. So we can visit our local museums. We can read culturally diverse books. We can come out of the box that we're used to existing in and expose ourselves intentionally to other experiences. This list is not exhaustive also. As a personal example that I always like to share is that I learned so much more. I thought I knew a lot about my own history, but I learned so much more about my family by subscribing to Ancestry.com. And it just made me so proud to learn about my own heritage and learn more about my own family members. And then it mobilized me. It helped me to appreciate my existence. And then it mobilized me to want to be able to contribute too. Like, what will my grandkids see if they get on Ancestry.com and see my name? And so there's an experience that you have when you take these steps. And by learning about our cultures and others, not only do we build a sense of pride in our heritage, but we can also develop this deep respect for other cultural experiences as well. When we learn about others, it bridges the gap, helps us to find that commonality in our experiences that makes us very sensitive to each other. Because when we're communicating, we want to communicate with that sensitivity. And so before I move on, I will say one more thing. I want to note the hot tip. If you can jump back for a second, bear with Alissa is trying to read my mind here. But I wanted to note that hot tip of just that while getting to know other cultures, when we're stepping outside of our own, we're stepping into other cultural spaces, that we want to make sure we're doing this with respect and a genuine desire to make real connections. And also recognize where there are spaces that don't belong to us, and just being respectful, not stepping into spaces that aren't for us. So keep that in mind as you join us on this journey. And now, if you can go forward. The next guidepost that we're going to talk about is to treat others how they want to be treated. And so growing up, I was always told to treat people how I wanted to be treated. But we found that it's now more than ever, it's really important to let others guide how we treat them. It sounds easy, but obviously, looking at the state of things in the world, it's a lot harder than it sounds. And it's so important to reiterate, especially for evaluators. There are others too. I'm just speaking to our evaluation community, because we are in a position where we can demonstrate respect to people by using strategies that ensure that people are recognized and that they're appreciated and that their experiences are respected. We share accurate stories. We can do that intentionally, and we can share space. And this is so important because it gives us the opportunity to put this into practice. But speaking of putting this into practice, I will jump into some strategies for this topic too. All right, so we have a lot here. I think you find when you get into the guide, you'll find that there's a lot there. And I do want to be mindful of time, so I'm not going to go too deep into all of these, but they're also important. So I'm going to just give a quick overview. So the first one is to respect your audience's experiences. And this is being mindful on purpose, again, intentionally, thinking about the effects of systemic oppression and how it has created challenges for groups that are not experienced by others. Put a pin in this thought because this is the one that we're going to come back to and dig into a little bit more deeply, but that's such an important thing that we can all do. The second point is to respect each dimension of a person's identity. Again, we have learned about intersectionality, and that's what we're talking about here. But it's so important to recognize that each of us are human beings that identify in a variety of ways. Our identities are multifaceted. We are very complex. And there are so many people that experience marginalization almost exponentially, if you could quantify it. I'm a quant person, so I'm always trying to find a way to quantify something. That is a way to incorporate it. We can always see how there are groups of people that are experiencing marginalization on top of marginalization on top of marginalization because of the different facets of their identity, not just racial, their gender identity, cultural identity, racial identity, whether they're born in the United States or whether they're born outside of the United States. There are different experiences that people have, and how they experience navigating the world is different. And we as evaluators have the power to respect each dimension of a person's identity. That is showing their humanity. And so I could spend a lot of time on this, but again, there are great examples in the guide. I don't want to take all of your time, so I'm going to jump to accessibility now, making sure that we create content that is easy to find, understand, and use. So this is a reminder. Again, we probably hear this a lot, to make sure that what we communicate is shared in a way that it can actually be received by others. Sometimes treating others how they want to be treated is ensuring that they can even engage with what we put out. And it's a really easy way. There's a lot of resources that we can share about different ways that we can make our products more accessible, whether it's visually accessible or even when you're talking about language justice and how you put things out into the world. There are different resources that we can tap into for that. All right, but let's dig deeper into showing respect for our audience's experiences. Again, a lot just from that one strategy. Here are some tactical ways that we can approach this. The first one is, all of these are very important. So if I feel like I'm moving fast, I'm sorry, I just want you to be able to share your questions. Using asset-based framing. That just means that we are intentionally centering people and the solution rather than victim blaming. As discussed earlier, and as probably weaved throughout some of what we've been saying, we coexist with many groups that have been systemically oppressed and experience marginalization at varying levels. And we want our reporting to challenge the systems that have created these conditions for everyone, really, for those of us that have to exist within these challenging circumstances, not justify the oppression. And so we want to make sure that our words, our language is very people-centered, and that we're challenging the system and the barriers and the challenges that have been created by the system. That's very important. We also want to focus on the behavior or condition and avoid labeling. I have a bunch of examples that I thought about here. The one that I always share is that my daughter was diagnosed with autism when she was like 5, but we know her as Ryan, but we call her Rai. She is definitely, there are things that she does that are characterized by her being autistic, but she's a whole human being that has autism. And there are so many people that have autism, but are completely different people from Rai Rai. That's just a quality that they share. And so we try to be mindful of the person that is behind the condition and not just tag these labels that kind of take the humanity out of the way that we perceive the communities that we serve. All right. And then the third one is building power by creating choice, which is a really, really nice way of saying give people their autonomy. We know what it feels like to have the benefit of autonomy. This kind of covers a lot of the things that we were talking about before, too. Giving people the opportunity to self-identify is huge. In our current political climate, there's so many tensions around labels that are placed on identities, and oftentimes they don't include or consider the person that is within that identity. And so we reject the labels that some people may reject labels that are placed on them. A good one right now is Latinx versus Latine. Not there's a difference between how people want to be identified. Black versus African American. There's a difference. So when we ask people in studies or in how we're collecting our information or how we're sharing how they want to be described, it gives them that autonomy to say how they want to be described. All right, and then using nonviolent language. This is challenging because our language is so rooted in violent rhetoric. And honestly, there's so many things that I did not know until I started reading about language. And now I hear it. I hear it all the time when I go to speak and think, ooh, how did this term or this phrase come about? So we don't always know. We may not realize just how triggering our language could be for those, especially for those who have experienced violence. It seems harmless for us, perhaps, or maybe not if we have experienced violence, but there are effects that our words have. And I think that's really the point here, is thinking about what we're saying and what kind of reaction we could be creating for the person who hears or sees what we have written down. For those that are less familiar with this topic, we have some excellent resources that we can share around using nonviolent language as well. Now, with that, I'm going to pass back to Alissa, and she's going to go into our final two guideposts.
Thank you, Shelli. So our third guidepost is centering marginalized people, voices, and experiences. And often it is, the reality is that it's our voices as evaluators that tell the stories of people who are part of our evaluation, right? Like that's part of our job, is to like process across many different voices. And often these voices are the voices of people who are marginalized and have experienced oppression, right? It's like part of why they're part of an evaluation or usually receiving some social service. And the most important thing that we can do is make sure that our communications, to make sure that our communications are equitable, is to use our power, the power that we have as evaluators, to amplify their voices, tell the stories the way that feels true to them, so that their voice is out there, and it's not ours processing their voice. And so our research really led us to two strategies that can help us to do this. So the first is stepping aside, right? There's so often where, you know, we get wrapped up in our analysis and we're excited and we're like, oh, we like had this great insight and we want to communicate it the way that makes sense for us. But maybe sometimes we're not the right messenger. Maybe there are times where people who are part of our evaluation can be that person who are communicating back in a way that makes sense to them. Like, how can they be involved in that direct communication of some of the messages from the evaluation? This is not always possible, and there's still other ways that you can step aside. So you can, as Shelli, shared, ask people, how do you want to be recognized in this work, to make sure that they feel like they see themselves in there, that their story is authentic and true to them. It's being curious, listening, observing, being connected in a relational way to the people who are part of your evaluation, so that you do feel like you can represent them if need be. And Another thing is maintaining the emotional intensity of people's experiences. And I'll talk about that in another second. A second strategy you can do is compensating and sharing learnings with contributors. So, one thing that I'm seeing more of, and we're actually working on in our organization right now, is a compensation policy for people who are part of our evaluations, and how do we recognize them for their time, effort, and also information, paying them for the data that they have to share with us. It can be making sure that our communications, as I shared before, like, are for the people who are contributing to our evaluations. How do we make sure that we're directing our messages like to them, and what's helpful and important for the people who have contributed? Ultimately, I think it really helps just like have this mindset. And again, there's so much here about mindsets, but it's having this mindset of, how to amplify the voices that went into this evaluation, right? How do we use this evaluation to become a platform? How do we share back findings through methods that are a way to turn some of these stories into a megaphone, right? How do we amplify the voices of people that we're learning from? And how do we avoid extraction? I think leading with that value can really make a big difference in your communications, because so much of what we do, honestly, right now, is pretty extractive as evaluators. So if we have that mindset and we make little shifts, we can make a big difference there. So I mentioned kind of maintaining the emotional intensity of people's experiences. This is part of the first strategy of stepping aside. And, so often when we use people's stories as data, their stories can become watered down. Feelings are removed from the findings to emphasize the facts, right? I think that this is something that we can stop doing to the extent that we're doing. I want to share a story because I experienced this once. I was working on a case study of a community advocacy group, and they really had this negative experience with a program lead who was part of that group, and to the point where they really felt like that leader's actions were harmful to them. They were volunteers, so it really affected their experience. And so, I included this in my case study, and I shared back a draft with them. And they were furious. Like, they hated the case study that I shared back. Because even though it was in there, like it came up more as like a challenge factor. And it was clear from our conversation, like they did not feel heard. Like their true experience was not represented in this case study. And thankfully, I chose this approach where I was sharing it back with them. They had the opportunity to share with me like where I made a mistake, so that I could correct that before it went anywhere else, because this was going to go to their funder. It was going to, be an opportunity. So I was able to update that case study. I was also able to like talk to our funder and say like, hey, like I think a direct conversation would be really helpful here. Like this case study may not even be the best method for learning about the challenge that they experienced here. And just think of all the times that maybe you haven't shared back a report with people who contributed to your evaluations. Like, what are you missing that you may not know about what they think about the way you're representing their stories? So the final guidepost that we found from our research is to use anti-racist narratives to further equity, right? And so this is all about not accepting the status quo, but using language and images to shift minds and behaviors towards equitable practices. So in other words, communications itself can be a tool for equity. And there are two strategies that can help us do that. The first is telling the whole honest story. we can be explicit about the role of race. We can make sure that we're including current historical contexts and systems and how they're affecting individuals' experiences, and making sure that we're capturing positive stories and not just kind of the negative aspects, and vice versa. A second strategy is creating solidarity by finding common threads. Like, this is really particularly important in very polarized political climates and polarized like issue areas and topics, because that's how we create change, is when we can come together for them. And so the way that a lot of people come together is through values. It's through a vision for a better world. Like, these are things that like all people can get behind, regardless of their political affiliation. You can also be very relatable by personalizing information. So like telling individual stories and contextualizing data through storytelling, and how, you know, individuals are affected and the whole nuance related to that, right? Like, people connect with emotion and that personal experience. And finally, making sure that you're using messages to build alliances, right? Like, so you may have heard about like wedge strategies. Like, these are specific political strategies that are designed to divide people, to anger one group or another in order to like build kind of attention and interest and outrage. And that's not how we create an equitable world, is by dividing us. We create an equitable world by choosing messages that build bridges, that bring connections between groups and not pit them against each other. And so that's, you know, that's an important thing to think about, is, you know, how are we creating alliances through the messages that we're choosing. And so part of the honest story is talking about strengths. And I'm going to take this moment to pass back to Shelli, because I think that she does such a good job of explaining what this looks like in practice.
Thank you, Alissa. So something that we talk a lot about, and we've talked about this a lot when we were designing this guide, was to tell stories that inspire, and what that really means. And the way that I envision it is thinking about how those who are the most impacted by what you are sharing feel about the information that you're sharing, and how that distress could lead to an action. And so thinking about telling stories that are inspirational, in order to respect their feelings, and also to help to keep them motivated and mobilized. So as a personal example for myself, this is one that is fairly new. I was thinking about it this morning, but as a mother, I cannot tell you throughout life how distressing it has been, for both of my children, to constantly hear about the dangers that Black women face with maternal and child health. But I'm feeling it even more now, because I'm currently expecting my third child. And on Zoom, of course, you can't see that. You see me from here. But because and this has been very distressing. I'm in this work. I'm in a time where I should be able to feel joy and excitement and celebration. But this is very scary. Those stories are very scary, especially for me as a Black woman. And while I'm not suggesting that we don't tell those stories, because it's important that we recognize these disparities, right? We have to talk about them so that we can work together to solve them. But there are a lot of positive stories as well. For instance, there are a lot of Black women who have gone into work as doulas. There's obstetricians, gynecologists. They're working to support these issues. And when I hear about all of the work that these women are doing, it makes me feel personally overwhelmingly safe. And it takes that fear away so that I can feel the joy that you should have when you're having a child. So it also makes me think of how I can be a support. Like, what can I do? I have these skills. How can I help support? So the takeaway here is that inspirational stories can mobilize and promote change. And so just thinking about what the feelings are for those that are the subject of the issue. How do they feel? This is their reality. Yeah, and that's very important to recognize their reality. And so with that, what's next? All right, we're getting close. Want to make sure that you have time for questions. So I'm going to move through this last section really quick. But what is this all about? We shared a lot of information with you, but we want to highlight a final point that will help you to bring all of this into context. And that is what you can do. Again, we've shared a lot today, so this is still just a blip of all of the points that are shared in the guide. And we know that this is a lot of information. And so we want to spend the last few minutes just reiterating why this is so important, and highlighting that this is really a call to action. The reason why we're talking about this today is because we want to motivate you. We hope that you leave this webinar feeling motivated to begin or continue your journey into equitable communications. And it's not this big, expensive initiative to get started. There are several small ways that you can get started that we highlighted here. Continue to educate yourself, share what you've learned, advocate for equitable communications, and take this forward in the ways that you can. Adopt that learning mindset. Just realize that this is an individual process. You can begin to get engaged with this. Keep learning, start where you can. And remember, this is a journey that we're all on. No one has perfected it. So, including ourselves, we emphasize that. So please, lastly, share back what you learn on your journey. We are in this community with you, and we want to continue to grow and build. But all right, now let's get to some questions.
Thanks so much, Shelli. So this is a link here to the guide itself. You've been giving us highlights of the guide. You've talked about the 4 guideposts. Thanks very much. Do we have any questions? I've looked on Facebook. I don't have questions from Facebook. Do we have any questions from the chat?
I believe the only question we have from the chat right now is if the slide deck can be also made available.
And I'm sorry, Shelli. I don't know if you have an answer to that now. I kind of whether or not the slide deck will be available. You've got right there the link to the Equitable Communications Guide, which has even more detail than the presentation that Alissa and Shelli have given us today.
Yeah, and I'll mention, you know, Shelli talks about how there's different resources for things such as, you know, accessibility is a really easy thing to do at the end of like your report. So there are things that you can do, such as making sure you're using accessible language. Like there with AI tools, like there's so many amazing opportunities and websites that we have linked in the guide that can help flag like where your language is maybe becoming like a little too jargon or too advanced for like a public audience. And they can like help you understand that. There's also a way that you can kind of test how your report or like data visualizations are like the color use. Like do people who are colorblind, like can they see the differences that you're trying to highlight? Is that working? So there are some great links and resources in the guide itself related to each guidepost. So there is a lot of great stuff in there.
Yeah, I second that. And the visuals and language was pulled directly from the guide. So I really feel like the best resource for us to leave you with is the guide itself.
I have a question for you. One really nice piece of guidance that you gave was to ask people who are beneficiaries of the evaluation how they would like to see themselves represented. If I'm going to ask that question, then I need to engage with intended beneficiaries, you know, before I start collecting information at some point during the planning phase. So if that's not part of a proposal or a contract that I'm engaged in, how would you suggest going about doing that, putting that into the planning?
I can jump in with my thought on this, Alyssa, if you want to back me
Sure.
up. But we had a really good, we actually presented this discussion at AEA, and we were working with someone at the Urban Institute, Jonathan Schwabish, and I thought some of the ideas that he shared were really great, especially given that, yes, this is a challenge. We work with our beneficiaries throughout. We try to, that's part of our practice, but that's not standard for everyone. But there may be times where you have categories that are long and try to be as extensive as possible. I think even the census has started to do a really great job of just adding in as many designations as possible, or even saying, please note that some disclaimer, some acknowledgement that if you have missed an identification, that, this is what you were thinking about, having the option for someone to add in their choice, even if it's a short answer response, is good as well, even though it does create a little bit more work for us on the back end, because we have to, of course, make sure that our data is clean. But just taking that extra step to acknowledge and include as many identities as possible, while also giving someone the opportunity to self-identify, is a good start, I will say. What are your thoughts, Alyssa?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good suggestion, Shelli. And another thing that comes to mind, and this does go into more like the data equity side rather than the communications part, but it's, you need to have data equity in order to like communicate that data in an equitable way. But if you can have conversations at the beginning in the evaluation design. So even if it's not originally part of like the ask, is, we try to build collaborative relationships with like whoever's funding us and has kind of that ultimate power at the end of the design, at the end of the day, and pushing back against that level of power, right? And saying, hey, so we're noticing that, everything is going through you for like approval and in the design, and, here's like, I want to educate you, and using that language, but basically like, I want to educate you about equitable evaluation, and talking about what it means to work more closely with the people who are part of your evaluation. And that can benefit your entire approach, including your data collection and what language you're using there, as well as like your evaluation questions all the way through to the communication point. So if you start that early, it can benefit every stage of the evaluation.
Beautiful.
Agreed.
You've also put a lot of emphasis on storytelling here, which I appreciate. But again, sometimes the funders' plans might involve more data than storytelling. Do you go so far as to maybe, like, do you even try to provide an outline of what the report might look like by the end to promote storytelling as part of the evaluation?
Yeah, I love that question, David, because I think it appreciates like the state of the world that we're in right now, where it's almost like, quantitative data numbers are, like they reign. And what part of the reason that we created this guide for like public consumption and not just for ourselves as reference is because we want to use it as an advocacy tool, because we see that so many people want to ignore the stories and don't fully appreciate the true rigor in storytelling through evaluation. And what we're trying to share through some of this communications guide is how you miss so much of the story of the true reality of what you're evaluating when you don't include emotion, you don't include story, you don't work with the people who are part of your evaluation to understand what messages are most important. And you know, I say all this because we also are struggling with a lot of clients of ours who don't kind of understand that. Like they still see kind of that quantitative data as like being like what's most rigorous, and like we'll tell them like the most true story of like their program, and we don't believe that. So you know, we're hoping that this can be a tool to help work with our clients more, and like sometimes I expect we'll be very more successful than others. But it's the state of the world we're in right now, and I hope that we'll see some progress in that, because storytelling is really important. And you know, coming from a communications background, it does upset me sometimes to see some of the evaluations like chop up stories into these little like pieces of like, oh, you know, here's what's working well, bullet points, knowing, you know, the depth of emotion and life experience behind those. And all of that is lost when we omit the storytelling. So I'm so glad that you asked that question. And I think we have a long way to go, but I really hope that our fields can do better and really push the social sector overall to humanize data in a new way.
I just want to add to that, like that was perfectly said, Alissa, and something that came to my mind practically about our like engagement with our clients, David, is that we do build in touch points that allow us to share with them basically what Alissa did. We sell, I hate to say it that way, but that's what we do. We sell
Fine.
the stories with the quantitative data. We say that we have this data we would like to give you. You could benefit from this by in this way. This is what we want you to know. And so we definitely those extra touch points and taking the time to say, this is what we propose and this is what you're going to get from what we collect if we're given the opportunity to, has given us the opportunity to collect the quantitative data. Quantitative data is important too, and contextualize it with those stories. So I think that's very important, building in those extra touch points with your clients or funders or whoever is leading the charge with your work.
Yeah, and here's if that's, you know, hard to make happen, like here's a little sneaky thing that we've been doing. So, you know, sometimes funders are like, data, like give me numbers. So you get them numbers. But then what you can do is you can say, hey, this is a great conversation tool, right? So the numbers become just the beginning of a way for people to then directly tell their own story. So maybe we would bring together a few of the people who contributed to the evaluation with our client, who's usually their funder. And you can like look at the numbers together, and then they can tell their stories related to the data. So it's, you know, a little sneaky way that we've been slipping it in or trying to lately.
Nice. I'm sorry, I'm unable to see the chat from Zoom. I don't see questions in the Facebook area. Are there any questions from the Zoom chat?
Yes, and you guys sort of answered one of them, which is if I'm able to kind of paraphrase, sort of balancing volume needs. So making sure you have proper sample sizes, that kind of thing, with kind of allowing for this inclusive storytelling, more qualitative stuff. So I think you covered some of that, that balance. And then there's another question just sort of around providing some examples. I don't know if you want to get into examples per se, but maybe just talk a little bit more about avoiding violent language. I looked in the guide. There are a couple examples in the guide that I'd encourage people to look at, but maybe how do you become aware of it? Do you just Google lists? Like how do we get ourselves to the place where we're even more aware of the language that we're using?
I will say, the more that you study violent language, even if it is starting with a list, the more you become very aware of it. And to give an example, it's my first default every time to want to say that I'm going to take a stab at something. But I hear it in my mind now every time that I go to say in our group chat, okay, and I always say, I'll make an attempt. But the more that you hear it, the more you think, that's not what that's not what I'm trying to say. And that's just one phrase. There are so many phrases that now I think, well, why is that? That is, that is violent. So it's something that you become more sensitized to the more that you look up those different phrases, and then you start to hear it and it's like, whew, yeah, okay. But we're desensitized right now. So I would say exposure for sure, and education helps to build that sensitivity.
Yeah, and I'll say Elizabeth Grimm is an evaluator who wrote a great guide around nonviolent language with some common examples from the evaluation space and the social sector. So I think that's linked in the guide, but that's a really great resource to check out.
Mhm.
Great, thank you, David. There's no more questions. There's one more resource in the chat that I'd encourage people to look at, but maybe over to you to wrap us as we are at time.
Just one more question. Like I've had the chance to see you speak at the American Evaluation Association, and as you said, this is the most recent version. And so, what thoughts do you have about ongoing updates?
That's a good one. I'm going to defer to Alissa on that, put you on the spot.
Oh no, wait, I zoned out because I was looking at the chat. Someone said resource and I got excited. Sorry, what was the question?
We're talking about ongoing updates, like this being more of an updated version.
That's such a good question. Honestly, when we developed this originally, we were like, oh, wouldn't it be so cool to like put it on a website and make it interactive and people can add their own resources. And oh my gosh, so much extra time and money. And like this is a self-funded project. So we ultimately did not do that. We still have like goals and aspirations maybe in the future. But in the meantime, if you have any other resources like this really cool Reels resources I have not heard of before, like please send them our way. Right now we just have like a spreadsheet going of other cool resources that we're learning about, and hopefully we'll figure out a way to kind of share it back. But you're absolutely right that equitable communications is like constantly evolving as we learn and grow ourselves and as society changes and adapts and evolves. So there probably will be some updates in the future, but none planned at the moment.
That's okay. No, that's good. I mean, and let's see, what can I say? I really appreciate you sharing with us the 4 guideposts. I appreciate you giving us a taste. I encourage all of our listeners to go and access the Equitable Communications Guide. You'll see it in a PDF online. So I just want to, I appreciate the time you've spent with us today speaking about communicating data findings equitably. I want to thank you. I just find this guide so practical. Like when I started hearing about, equitable evaluation, I really enjoyed a lot of what I was reading, but then I would say to myself, well, now how do I put this into practice? And your guide is so practical. Okay. So just thanks very much for putting this together and for sharing this with us today.
Thank you, David.
Oh, thank
you,
you.
everybody. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, and thanks everyone who's here, honestly, for caring about this, because it's definitely something I think that's missing in our field right now, and we need to do better about. So thanks for caring.
Yeah.